Between ancient scrolls, forgotten kings, and words that have spanned centuries, there exists a prophecy that many say points directly to Jesus, while others swear it is nothing more than a forced reading. And it is here that the mystery lies, one that sparks our curiosity and moves those who believe and those who doubt. We will discover the historical context of these words, how Jews and Christians have understood them over time, and why this debate still impacts faith, culture, and even the way we view history itself. Ultimately, can a prophecy truly sustain Christianity? Or does it lead us to even deeper questions about truth, hope, and the meaning of life? Before speaking of the Messiah, the Bible already did something curious. It pointed a finger at entire empires and said, without mincing words, "This is going to fall." A famous example is Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, described in the book of Nahum as proud, violent, and condemned. The text speaks of fire, plunder, panic, and even waters invading the city, images that sound almost cinematic. Centuries later, modern excavations and ancient accounts such as those by Diodorus Siculus confirm that Nineveh was destroyed by a coalition of enemies and that floods from the Tigris River may have weakened its walls. This is not automatic proof of a miracle, of course, but the coincidence is striking, especially because Nahum does not write as a cold historian, but as someone convinced that the fall was inevitable. The same pattern appears in other cities cited by the prophets, always with details that seem more specific than a simple, "every empire falls one day." This creates a curious effect. The ancient text begins to dialogue with real history, like two pieces of a puzzle made in different eras. Still, using these predictions as direct proof of Christianity is complicated, as debates arise about when the texts were written and how they were preserved. Scholars discuss whether part of these descriptions could have been redacted after the events, something common in the ancient world. Even with these caveats, the feeling remains. There is something too strange to be ignored. Not every impressive prediction becomes a solid argument, and this is where the conversation gets more honest. When we look at prophecies like those of Tyre, in Ezekiel, which speaks of the fall of a Mediterranean commercial power, we see parallels with the campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar and later of Alexander the Great around the 4th century BC. Historians like Arrian and Quintus Curtius recount the siege of the island city, something that many connect to the biblical text. But the problem is clear. The prophecy mixes poetic images with general facts, and the fall of coastal empires was not exactly rare. Furthermore, scholars discuss whether parts of the text may have been edited later, which weakens its use as proof. The same applies to the famous decree of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, cited in Isaiah as the liberator of the Jews from the Babylonian exile, something confirmed in sources like the Cyrus Cylinder, now in the British Museum. For those who already believe, this sounds like incredible precision. For the skeptic, it may be a retrospective reading of already known events. In other words, these prophecies may encourage the heart, but they stumble when they need to convince the reason of an outsider. They function more as internal reinforcement than as an apologetic hammer. And it is precisely by recognizing this limit that the narrative begins to shift its focus, as if to say, okay, let's look at something even more central. Imagine reading a long novel full of parallel stories and realizing that all of them, little by little, run toward the same ending. This is more or less how many view the Bible. After these prophecies about nations, the focus narrows. It is no longer a city, but someone who would come to change the course of history. The Old Testament begins to sound like a promise, while the New presents itself as a fulfillment, an idea defended by Christian authors since the first centuries, such as Justin Martyr. But, to be fair, objections arise immediately. What if it's all coincidence? What if the texts are too vague? Or worse, what if Jesus' followers shaped his story to fit the prophecies? These questions are not new and appear in both academic debates and books by modern critics. Still, the proposition is bold. The dozens of texts, written over centuries by different authors, form a coherent portrait of an expected Messiah. For some scholars like N.T. Wright, this reflects a real hope of ancient Judaism. For others, it is a later theological construct. The fact is that the Bible presents itself as a single narrative, not as a loose collection of sound bites. And when this guiding thread is followed, it starts way back on the first pages as a promise never fully kept. It is like hearing an unfinished melody that insists on calling for the next chord. And that chord begins to echo in the very history of Israel. From Genesis to the prophets, the history of Israel sounds like someone waiting for a train that is always late but never fails to arrive. There are promises of land, peace, and blessing, but none are fully fulfilled, creating an atmosphere of constant expectation. Gradually, this hope gains a face, a king from the line of David, as announced in 2 Samuel chapter 7, who would bring a just and lasting kingdom. Royal Psalms, such as number 2 and number 110, reinforce this image of a ruler chosen by God. Along with this, the figure of a prophet like Moses in Deuteronomy and an eternal priest as in Psalm 110 also emerges. Everything begins to converge on one person who would unite roles that in practice never came together in anyone. Even when Jerusalem falls and the people are taken into exile in Babylon in the 6th century BC, this flame does not go out. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel speak of restoration, and genealogies are carefully preserved, as if to say, the lineage is still alive. Historians confirm that after the return with Persian support, the House of David no longer had a throne, but it continued in the memory and popular hope. It is like keeping the key to a door that is not yet known when it will open. This waiting shapes the identity of the people and spans generations. We move forward to the 1st century, and the scene is tense. Judea lives under the rule of the Roman Empire, with high taxes and soldiers everywhere. Jewish writings of the time, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls found in Qumran, show that many expected not one, but 2 anointed ones, a Davidic king and a righteous priest. Others dreamed of a political liberator, someone in the style of Judas Maccabeus, hero of the revolt against the Greeks in the 2nd century BC. Even Roman authors, such as Suetonius and Tacitus, mention that there was a belief in the East that a powerful ruler would emerge from there. Each group imagined the Messiah in their own way, but almost all agreed on one thing: something big was about to happen. This melting pot of expectations explains why so many messianic leaders and pretenders arose during this period, such as Theudas and Judas the Galilean, cited by Flavius Josephus in his Jewish Antiquities. Hope was alive but without consensus, like puzzle pieces scattered on the table. Some wanted a sword, others wanted purity, others just justice and bread on the table. It is in this electric climate that Jesus of Nazareth appears, without an army, without a palace, and with a discourse that surprises friends and enemies. For some, he seemed to be everything. For others, nothing of what they expected. Amidst the expectations of power and glory, Isaiah, written centuries before, presents a figure that seems out of place. In chapter 53, the suffering servant emerges, someone despised, wounded, and silent in the face of accusations, who suffers not for his own errors but for those of others. The text speaks of rejection, vicarious suffering, unjust death, and even a burial linked to the rich, something strange for a common condemned man. Manuscripts like the Great Isaiah Scroll, found in Qumran and dated before Christ, show that this text was already circulating long before Christianity. This dismisses the idea of a late editing to fit Jesus into the story. Still, the passage is uncomfortable because it does not match the classic image of a triumphant liberator. Some later Jewish interpreters said that the servant represents the nation of Israel itself, but this reading faces internal difficulties. The text describes an innocent person suffering for the sins of others, something that does not fit well with a nation that, in the prophets themselves, is frequently accused of guilt. Furthermore, the servant dies and is then exalted, a movement difficult to apply to a collective people. Ancient records show that certain messianic readings of Isaiah 53 existed before Christianity, even if they were not the majority. It is like a forgotten painting in the basement of history, which someone suddenly decides to hang in the main room. And when this painting is placed alongside the life of Jesus, the question ceases to be comfortable. On one hand, the scriptures spoke of a victorious king, a descendant of David who would rule the nations with justice. On the other, they described a humiliated servant who would suffer in silence. For centuries, these two figures walked separately, like parallel tracks that never touched. The proposal of the first Christians was explosive. Both met in Jesus. The death on the cross would be the fulfillment of the suffering passages, while the resurrection would mark the beginning of the promised reign. To the Roman world, this sounded like madness. To many Jews, like a scandal. After all, a crucified Messiah was the opposite of what was expected of a liberator. And here enters a curious detail. This story did not seem like good propaganda. Following a leader executed by the state was risky, socially shameful, and politically dangerous. Historians like Bart Ehrman, even skeptical of Christian theology, recognize that the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most solid facts of ancient history. Inventing a defeated Messiah would hardly help a nascent movement grow. Furthermore, intentionally coordinating details like birthplace, manner of death, and public rejection would be almost impossible. The narrative does not sound like a well-calculated plan, but like something that imposed itself on the followers themselves. And when these pieces fit together, the puzzle becomes even heavier. In Daniel chapter 9, one of the most debated passages in the entire Bible emerges, like a hidden stopwatch in the middle of the narrative. The text speaks of an anointed one who would be eliminated, bring atonement for sin, and appear before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Historically, we know from Roman and Jewish sources, such as Flavius Josephus, that the temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD by the legions of Titus. This creates an uncomfortable time window for interpreters, because Jesus lives exactly in that interval. It is true that the 70 weeks generate varied calculations and intense discussions among scholars, from antiquity until today. Still, the connection between the death of the Messiah, the forgiveness of sins, and the collapse of the temple does not go unnoticed. When Daniel 9 is read alongside Isaiah 53 and the Davidic expectation, the effect is not that of isolated proof, but of accumulation. Each text alone can be questioned. Together they form a weight difficult to ignore, like several arrows pointing in the same direction. Even critics admit that this convergence is, at the very least, surprising. For the first Christians, this explained not only who Jesus was, but why his death made sense. Human history ceased to be a chaotic sequence and gained a guiding thread of hope. It is no coincidence that this idea has spanned centuries, empires, and cultures. And ultimately, the question that remains is not just historical but deeply personal. And so, after passing through ruined cities, forgotten kings, dusty scrolls, and a figure who divides history into before and after, the feeling remains that we are not just dealing with ancient texts, but with a narrative that still provokes, inspires, and makes one uncomfortable. Perhaps everything is a well-woven coincidence. Perhaps it is faith reading history with different eyes. Or perhaps there is, in fact, something extraordinary behind this improbable convergence. What is certain is that millions of people, over centuries, have found in these prophecies not just arguments, but meaning, forgiveness, and hope for daily life. So the question that echoes as the final chord of this melody is simple and profound. If these words truly point to Jesus, what does that change in the way you see history and yourself?